So our speakers today are Sanaya Mohammed. She's a chief of programs for these reciprocal community services. And then we have Dan Roten, the executive director of Hope Works. I'm sure you all want to take turns, introduce yourself and telling the people more about you.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Amaya. So this conversation today is called Can I Say That? An impolite conversation about workforce development in Philadelphia. Thank you for everybody coming out. I see Raina's familiar face and a bunch of other familiar names. So thank you for coming. If you can't already hear it in my voice, I'm a little bit under the weather. So, hey, God bless the Zoom, right? So we can still do this together and have this conversation. So we'll do our best to ask the questions that are loudly whispered in quiet spaces that set us back from reaching our goals or from our work from reaching our intended audiences. Before we get started, I'll take 1 minute. We'll take a minute to introduce ourselves a little bit more. Dan, go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Great to be here. It's a really great. I'm super excited about this conversation. I'm Dan Roden, Executive Director at HopeWorks Camden. Fundamentally, what HopeWorks does, we take young adults who are walking in, typically making less than $400 a year. When they walk out the door at HopeWorks, after training with us and working for us, on average, they're making right now over $43,000 per year, and 90% of them are still working 12 months later. How we do that is we train folks in technology, front-end web development, geographic information systems. We use a trauma-informed approach to help them get professionally ready. But training isn't enough. So then we employ them first in our GIS and web development businesses to prepare, give them a living wage job, give them a professional portfolio, and then we pipeline them right into employment partners. And so we're really honored to be a bigger part of this workforce development system and really excited to join the conversation today.
Well, welcome to Philadelphia. You jumped ashore, so we're happy to have you here, right? So my name is Sanaya Mohammed, and yeah, like Amaya said, I'm the Chief of Programs at Episcopal Community Services, which is a multi-service anti-poverty nonprofit organization that served over 1,500 people in the past 5 months of our fiscal year thus far. Our stabilization, prevention, and transformational programs provide youth, adults, elders with food and housing security, health and wellness, youth development, and financial management programs through holistic coaching services. In the context of the workforce development space, we have some new formalized pilot partnerships with the West Philadelphia Skills Initiative and Graduate Philadelphia under a program alumni recruitment or co-enrollment model, because we recognize that in order for the Philadelphia workforce to thrive, they need cash incentives to reward goal achievement, emergency funds when dental care seems like a luxury, and match savings programs to build wealth. Human lives are complicated, and so we build our programs to guide and support our participants so they can enrich their personal and professional journeys as they so determine, right? Okay, great. So Amaya, if you could drop our links in there, that'd be really helpful in the chat. And like Amaya said, we're going to keep the chat open. So if you've got questions, thoughts, you want to say, amen, I hear that, second that, please jump into the chat and let us know, okay? Or feel free to turn your camera on and let us know yes with a head nod too. That's always helpful, okay? All right, so great. So I'm going to take this seat here as the interviewer and Dan is my guest, as if we're on a daytime talk show, right? Okay, so we're gonna plop in your questions, your stories, your cheers, your boos, so we can ensure that this impolite conversation is relevant and helpful to you. So let's dive in. All right, up until recently, Dan, right, HopeWorks has been primarily operating in South Jersey and Camden, where many of Philadelphia's challenges survive, right, across the river. I've known you for years and routinely see the impact of HopeWorks Camden's efforts, but you and I have had some candid conversations, right, about this work. So to that end, Dan, what is the deep, dark secret in the nonprofit workforce development space that we can shed a light on here today?
Well, no, and I think we got to be honest, right? And that's why I'm so excited to be talking to you, because we can't be, right? And right, so here we go, right? So here's the first thing I think that a lot of us know, but don't say it out loud, right? Which is that we pretend there's all sorts of different workforce organizations. There's tech cleaning nonprofits, and there's building trades nonprofits, and but if we're honest, there's really only two types of workforce nonprofits. There are nonprofits that are squarely focused on their outcomes and delivering on their promise. And then there are the nonprofits that are squarely focused on making their donors, usually white, wealthy folks, happy and maintaining their funding. And we all have a pretty good idea which is which in the industry, if we're honest, right? And because they act totally differently. And I think you know this, the impact organizations, we all talk to each other. The donor-focused organizations, they all talk to each other. We don't work together because we can't, because we have fundamentally different goals, right?
Right.
Ones that are focused on making donors happy are really about guilt laundering. Does that make sense? Folks feel bad about the inequity of the world, so I'm going to give money to an organization. Typically, that organization is going to talk about how intractable the problem it is, how it's unsolvable, how if you just save money, right?
Yeah.
If you just do this, and that is highly effective for their goal because I can give money, but I don't have to feel bad about the way things are working, right? The impact-oriented organizations typically say, like, what we've done for the past 40 years must not be good because we're in the same boat, right? They tend to be fussy, right? And they tend to collaborate much more easily because that's the other thing is if you're focused on making donors happy, it's a scarcity mindset. There's only so many wealthy folks out there. You got to be the favorite, right?
Right.
When you focus on impact, what we know is there's plenty of poverty to work on. There's plenty of jobs to solve. It's much easier to collaborate, right? And so sometimes we pretend that there's a ton of workforce organizations out there, but in my experience, there's only two, right? And that's the dividing line.
Right. So to that end, so what are we screaming about, right? In quiet spaces. So oftentimes you and I, and others on this call, right? We're at a networking function and whatnot, and we'll say some things out loud, but then quietly with confidence that we trust, here's what we're really saying. So what are we really saying in these quiet spaces?
Well, and you know this, right? So like, and the first thing is that there are plenty of times folks say, oh, this organization or this neighborhood is going to be served by this program. And behind the scenes, a bunch of us are like, well, that's no good.
Right.
That's not going to work out. And we know we're going to have to work extra harder in that sector because not only do we know that that program is not effective, we know that what will happen is there will be a perception generated that that need has been met.
Right.
So it becomes unallowable to say that folks aren't getting workforce support in that area or that neighborhood because that has been covered publicly.
Right.
We know behind the scenes, we are getting in our effective programs, we are getting the graduates of that ineffective program.
Yep.
Right. Right. And we know it. We all know, oh, hi, it's person A from program B. Yes, come sit next to your colleague who was in class with you and who has a completion certificate, but no job, right?
Right. Oh, they did your resume and great. You can't access it ever again, or it's only in PDF printed out to you for that one thing. That's really helpful for you to apply for your second or third or fourth job because you have no idea how to access it. You don't know how to update it and you don't have the software to actually do it, but you got a resume done. Justice in America, workforce problem solved, right?
Well, if you wanted it, you would do it, right? It's a motivation problem, right? Yeah, exactly. And we're able to check that resume assistance was completed, right?
Yes.
And we're able to check that we help with the workforce. We know, and the staff doing it know it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
But again, that's not what the engine is meant to produce, right? The engine is meant to produce activity that appears helpful rather than outcomes, you know?
Yeah. So there's this perception, right, that to your point that the community is having their needs met, right? But the organization really isn't meeting those needs. And I wonder what it does really to undermine faith in public services. I submit that it actually challenges and undermines democracy, right? Because you've got people screaming loudly, I am not getting the help that I need, that I damn well deserve, but this organization is doing fine, right? This organization is employing people to serve me, and nothing's actually being done. So I'm like loudly banging my hands and no one seems to be hearing me. So I'm just going to disengage from the process, right? Bump, I'm just out and I'll figure it out on my own and stitch together from my own community and my own social network a solution to my problem. But really, the damage that has been done by an ineffective nonprofit is cascading. Yeah.
Really not right. I mean, we all see it. How many times have folks come into HopeWorks, and I suspect ECS, right, and other places. And the first thing we have to do is, because what HopeWorks does fundamentally is we make up the same promise. Hey, come to HopeWorks, we'll get you a great job.
Yep.
By the time someone walks through this front door of HopeWorks, they typically have been to 2 or 3 other nonprofits that made the same promise and broke it. Sometimes folks say, why does HopeWorks rely so heavily on word of mouth recruitment instead of flyering or social media? It's because in flyering and social media, we just look just like all those others.
Oof.
We are identical to
Yeah.
all the ones that let people down. The number of folks that have been at HopeWorks, like the number of times that that folks come into HopeWorks and we're doing the 3-week debrief, and we're like, so tell us about your first week or so. And I used to hear something warm and fuzzy, like I felt welcome. Sometimes you hear that. You know what we hear more often than not?
What?
Well, I'm a little surprised this isn't a scam.
So Josh put in the chat, I don't know if y'all saw, your first job is to try and prove that this is not that, right? You are newly building trust. Like, ignore what you heard or try and move past what you've experienced, because I'm asking you yet again for your trust. I'm asking you yet again to lean into the trauma you've experienced because of the failed promises, so that hopefully I fulfill my promise to you. That's a lot of work to have to do to build that relationship, to actually get that person where they're hoping to go. Yeah.
Somebody's put in the chat, and here's the other thing too, that like let's be real too. If I run a nonprofit that is based on activity and not outcomes,
Yeah.
and someone's not successful, the best way to make sure I keep my job is to blame the victim. If the best way for me to keep my job is to turn to the young adult or whoever that didn't get the job and say, you didn't try hard enough, you weren't motivated. Well, maybe if you had been like that person, and you know what, if I'm a young adult and I hear that enough, here's the toxic thing, I start to believe it.
Yeah.
Because a program is either incompetent or sometimes they're very competent, right? They're doing exactly what they're built to do, which is generate activity, which leads to more funding, which keeps staff employed, right? Which allows our program to get bigger and say we serve more folks, none of them get jobs. But to do that, it is essential that program never admits that the problem is there.
Right.
Which also means they can't do meaningful evaluation. They can't actually change what they're doing because they're predicated on the fact that it's the fault of the folks they're serving. And they're predicated on the fact that, poverty is like, rather than poverty just being like, folks need to get some money, it's actually a pretty solvable problem. Like, no, we have to make poverty into this mysterious, ephemeral thing, right? And so that means that they can't solve the problem. And if they do, it would threaten their fundamental things. So I have to not just fail people, it's worse than that. I have to poison them against themselves. I have to convince them they failed because it's their fault. And it's somebody who looks like me that does, right? So that means you got all that privilege, you got all that stuff, and you got all that society every day is telling you, right? That if you're not someone who looks like me, you're probably not worth as much, right? Every billboard, every TV show is telling you that.
Right.
And then you go to the one place where folks are supposed to understand you and folks are supposed to want to help you. And not only do you get more of it, you get a turbocharged version of it.
Right. So let's dive into that more, right? How is racism showing up, right, in the workforce development space?
So, I mean, and what we see, right, and I know you talk a lot about this, right, is the first thing that we see is that there's the implicit assumption that if you have money, right, which means if you're a donor or if you're a successful business person, you are probably smarter than me.
Right.
right? That if you have the, and that's, if your organization designed that way, that means that if a donor has a lot of money, they know how to run your organization or help your young adults or your constituents better than you do. That's the implicit understanding, right? And it can be difficult to challenge if your organization is optimized to maintain funding, right?
Yes. 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 So, and what does that mean, like, for folks of color who are in leadership positions in these nonprofits, right? When it's uncomfortable, they don't want to kiss the ring, right? To keep that money train going. And so they leave. Maybe they leave the space altogether. Maybe they leave an organization and try and do something else, right? But it definitely has a drain on talent who could be the most likely to support and see and recognize the challenges to move things forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that every person of color, right, in leadership knows the things. I am not saying that, but I am saying that it is a talent drain problem. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but like when it happens, we say it's the great resignation, right? We say that it's a hard field and that burnout is high, right? And
They're
we
quiet
say
quitting, right?
quiet quitting. I mean, every 6 to 8 months, there's a new like version to excuse um like really bad results or turnover, right?
Right, right, right. All right. So is workforce development then sustaining an exploitive system? So I'll give you some thoughts, right? Um, a part of me wonders about the workforce training field, right? The social field. It exists because our education system is not equipping folks to be able to enter the job market at the conclusion of their senior year of high school, right? It exists because we purposefully perpetuate poverty in communities of color, right? It exists, and I wonder if this organization says, yep, Sanaya is stamped, good to go. She completed our program. Her behavior will align with the standards, which are usually standards grounded in white supremacy of your organization so that she can come work for you, right? What does that mean? How do we feel about that? It feels uncomfortable. I've had this conversation out loud with colleagues before. And this is a riddle, a challenge for me personally.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Too is like, so like check out the scam, right? So like check this out. First, like let's acknowledge some of the fundamental craziness. So like how many programs for folks who are coming into reentry or trying to escape poverty are training programs that deliberately train them for poverty wage jobs in environments that are really like one great example is like if you look at many culinary environments, right, which is a popular training program option, right? Which are weird, right? To say most back of house kitchens are trauma informed environments, I don't think you could say that, right? Drug use in the field is rampant, right? And you want to talk about if someone has a PO, a place where it's going to be hard for them to be able to have the hours, right? Does culinary seem like a good option, right? And yet it's a very comfortable place for us to put Black and brown folks, right? Well, like check out how this works, right? So I'm an employer, probably a large employer who maybe wants to pay poverty wages, right? And so that would suck because as an employer, I should probably need to train my folks, but that's expensive. And once I take them on as my employers, then I have unemployment and they could sue me and all this stuff, right? So what's a smarter way to do it? I'm going to give a grant to a workforce development program. It's going to be a fraction of my profits. It's going to be a fraction of what my HR training budget would be, but I'm going to get much better press for it than if I just train my folks or pay them well. And then, so look at how you love me. I'm a good guy, right? And then I'm going to get free training because I'm going to expect that nonprofit to not just use my grant. I'm going to expect them to leverage philanthropy and government funds to train my people, right? At almost no cost to me. I'm going to get a shout out for being a good corporate partner because I'm going to get the publicity hit for the grant, and I'm going to get it again when I hire the folks that I needed to hire anyway. Then I'm going to pay them low wages, and when they don't retain, I will blame the employees or my nonprofit partner. It's a pretty good deal, right?
Right, right. It's a very good deal for folks in positions of power, right? Yeah. So talk to me about HopeWorks, right? You are mostly training Black and Brown folks into the technology industry. So 2 questions specifically about that, right? So why does HopeWorks train folks for these jobs that are so hard for people to access and succeed in?
Well,
Particularly,
that's the well, the short answer, right, is that's where the money is.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the short answer. And the other part of it too is that there's so many tech and tech adjacent jobs out there in every industry. And we're not the organization. There are some that are great, but we're not the organization training folks to be 80,000 a year developers, right?
right,
We're putting them in those entry level living wage jobs that can get promoted. The fact is, these are jobs. The number of young adults that walk into HopeWorks and say, "Oh, I'm thinking about being a QA analyst, or maybe a junior developer or a technical support person," is zero. Young adults come into HopeWorks because they need a job, and if you ask them what they wanted to do, a lot of them will say culinary, maybe some carpentry, right, or social work. Right, because the fact is, right, and programs that only want to train those, what they'll say is, "Oh, well, young adults we work with aren't interested in tech. They're not interested in those fields," right?
yeah,
Right. But the fact is, you know what I guarantee you, every young adult that walks into HopeWorks is interested in? You having enough money to pay the rent.
right,
Like if I went into a high school assessment and said, and they said, "What do you want to do?" I would not have said, "Well, I'm really interested in perhaps being management at a mid-sized workforce development nonprofit." That actually is not what I said, right?
right, right.
And yet here I am because I was exposed to the opportunities, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's the key is that what we need to do is, like be prepared, understand that folks want jobs that they can support themselves. That, you know, let's start there.
Mhm.
Let's get folks out of a place of poverty.
Mhm.
Let's start there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the key when you're looking at what we're doing. And Hope works with other great places, right? There's folks on the call that I see, with Philadelphia Skills Initiative. I see other folks, right, that are doing let's get them from where they are to where they want to be before we start, opining on, what they should, what's appropriate for them to wish to be.
Right. So now in the news in the past week or so, there's just been a massive amount of layoffs in the technology industry. So how do you think that this is going to impact Black and Brown workers? Are you already seeing it?
So, I will tell you at HopeWorks, the impact we're seeing,
Hmm.
none. And I think that has everything to do about who the media feels is important.
Hmm.
Because who's getting laid off from Facebook? Who's getting laid off from Twitter, right? Who's fighting with Elon Musk? Who's getting called out? Death, right?
Right.
It's nobody from HopeWorks, right?
Hmm.
And that's the thing that we don't talk often enough about is that the jobs that are paying living wages, right? The jobs that are making this work, we're placing folks at come on, we're placing folks at companies that are that are running the backbone of the internet, right? We're placing folks in jobs that make sure things keep working.
Hmm.
Those jobs aren't going,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I think what we see all the time in the media about that, if you think of a job in tech, you think that means, oh, someone who's got a $200,000 career as a developer, or oh, this person who did a startup, or this person who got stock options. The fact is, that's not most of the jobs in tech.
Yeah.
And I think when we look at that, then suddenly things start to change, right? You see the real opportunity there.
Yeah. All right. So we're gonna take a beat and intentionally pause and ask some folks if they want to jump into the conversation, whether that be through comments, questions, feedback. We welcome that part of the conversation. So we'll give a beat for folks to either take themselves off mute or type feverishly into the chat. And I'll put some thoughts. Taylor Davis is raising her hand. And Maya, can you take her off? Great. Hey, Taylor, what's up?
Hi, apologies for being off camera.
Okay.
I have a question for Dan. Dan, we know each other well. I've been impressed by HopeWorks, since working there. I'm no longer with HopeWorks, but working to partner with HopeWorks in a lot of ways. They do amazing work. I'm so happy that they're coming to Philly. I wanted to talk about, just circle back to what you were speaking before about organizations that aren't committed to the results, the different types of organizations. Either you're committed to the results and the outcomes, or you're just kind of taking money and employing people to serve people, but not necessarily committed to the results. I know, somewhat of HopeWorks history. I wasn't there for the change from the big transformation that you led when it happened, but HopeWorks kind of made that shift, right, of going from an organization that didn't have the best results to having some amazing outcomes and results. And I was wondering if you could speak to what led to the commitment to outcomes at that time. Like, why did you become an organization that was then committed to these outcomes when you could have instead maybe stayed on the track of, just getting money and pretending like everything's good?
One, that's it. And Taylor, that's an awesome question. I think that's a really important, just to highlight anyone on the call. Like, when I talk about organizations that were committed to, like, doing work but not always having outcomes, like, I'm not talking about some phantom organization. Like, that's us. That's essentially lived it. And Taylor, the key thing that the key change is for us is that we had Chuck McLister and some key board members who finally looked at the results and said, this doesn't make sense. And, what happened at HopeWorks was HopeWorks, like many, had this story of, like, yes, we're not very successful, but there's all these problems with poverty that that we can't overcome, like housing and mental health. So a couple of board members of HopeWorks said, well, look, if you're telling me that this is the problem, they took folks at their word. They said, if you say housing is the issue and you see that this is the issue, let's build some housing. And HopeWorks did, right? They built a residence. And Taylor, like, we built this residence. And if what HopeWorks was saying was true, that it was housing and mental health and lack of supportive environment, then logically, once you have a house, everybody should go live in it, and all those folks should be successful, right? That's it. That should work. But guess what really happened? Nobody moved in. And the results didn't get better. And this is where I have to credit the board, because what could have happened is they could have said, we've heard it. Well, they don't appreciate the opportunity, right? That's what they would have said, right? Or well, it's a complicated problem. But instead, what the board said is they said, kind of like, we were told that this was the problem. We have fixed that problem. It doesn't appear to be working. That must not be the problem. And that was the start, right? The key thing was not any kind of visionary change, not any kind of like big thing, but just having courageous thing to say, have a thesis. We think if we do A, we will get B. If that is true, if we do A and we get B and we want B, then we will do more of A. Right? And then we'll get more B. If we think if we do A, we will get B, and we in fact do not get B, we should not keep doing A.
Right.
Which sounds fundamental, right? It sounds fundamental. And remember, this is where, and then I'll stop talking. I was up to, but this is like a thing.
Well, this is
But,
good.
like,
Mhm.
this is a fundamental business model difference between nonprofits and for-profits. Folks always talk about the for-profit sector is better. Anyone who knows an entrepreneur knows the for-profit sector is a hot mess, right? Like they're a mess, right? They're a mess just like the worst of nonprofits. But here's the fundamental difference is if in a for-profit, if you are not effective, you will either change or go bankrupt. For-profit is not smarter than nonprofit, but they die faster.
Yeah.
Nonprofit, if you can either become more effective or you can become more effective at telling a story that is not true. Either one of those will allow you to survive. That's the fundamental difference between the two industries. And that difference is only enabled by racism, right? And structural inequity, right? And that's the difference is the nonprofit sector, the bad part of it, weaponizes the inequity in our society to sustain themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's the difference, right? And so Taylor, that's a great question, but I think that's where Hope works. Like we just had a board that was brave enough to say, like, you said that if we did A, we would get B. We did A, we did not get B. We're going to stop doing A and we're going to try something different. And he looked at it, then we tried B and it kind of worked, and then we tried C and that worked a lot better. And we okay, now this is the thing, right? But like, and we're still doing it. Like there's like been two things this year that I was sure would be awesome that were terrible. Like really bad, right? So we just stopped, right? And that's the thing. And then I'll stop talking. And here's the other thing: is like every time someone describes a nonprofit leader as a visionary, you have stifled innovation. Because here's the thing: if I'm a visionary, what I'm selling is my vision, which means if what I do doesn't work, I can't admit it to you because I've told you on a vision, which means I have to be right all the time.
That's right.
Right. So when you call folks like make nonprofit leaders like saints or visionaries, you're killing them. Right. Because then you're asking them to lie to you because their stuff isn't going to work. And if you just say, that's how it works. Right. But so if you say, boy, this is an effective organization and they test and iterate and make changes quickly, do that. But for God's sake, stop calling folks visionary. Right. But then I'm sorry. And then I'm going to stop talking. But because here's the other thing about visionaries, right? Is the reason it's nice to call someone a visionary is because if they're more visionary than you can't do what they did, so you don't have to feel bad about sitting back. That is why, per capita, the nonprofit sector has more proclaimed visionaries than any other sector.
Oof.
I think. Now I'll stop talking, but
Love it. Love it. Josh Park from West Philly, go for it.
Man, oh man, oh man, oh man, you two. You two are made of magic for putting this thing together. Thank you for it. I mean, I think I struggle with stopping talking as much as Dan does. It's a dangerous combination.
Yeah.
But
because you got two white guys who really have
all
good
right, yeah.
You're trying to save space for folks of color. And I appreciate you holding space.
So here comes the this is how I put it then. I mean, the question is, you've got some people, some organizations doing work what we would call the right way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in order to do work that well, it has to happen on a small scale.
Yeah.
Because it's all built out of relationships where those relationships demand each other to do really good work, demand that each other are accountable for their actions, demand each other to be better, to stop doing bad things if they're not working and to do the things that are working, to learn from each other and really be transparent with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Now, instead of thinking the way that you get more people to do this work is you teach them how to do the work well. Now what I'm hearing from you two is that there's lots of people out there that don't want to learn how to do it well because the way that they're doing it is systemically connected to their own success.
Yeah, to reward.
So I mean, the first question I was going to ask before that last question happened and the answer came across was like, who in the city of Philadelphia, let's just keep it there, do you think should be responsible for maintaining a better standard?
Yeah, so
And if not that, if that's not enough, who does the teaching that makes other people do better work?
I've got thoughts about that. It looks like Sheila's got some thoughts about that, or has a question independently of that. So this is Philanthropy Week, right? So I think, Josh, to answer your question, we are learning more about trust-based philanthropy, what that means around also building patience. And the piece you talked about, like scale, like having the big hullabaloo, right? Around, oh, we really built this great model and we can scale it to reach thousands of people right away. Like our mindset program right now, we have 30 people in the program and it's pilot phase. We are trying to figure it out and listening to participant voice to say, no, I need that. I need this. I want that. I want this, right? And recognizing that we aren't the workforce training organization, y'all are. So let's not try to duplicate something that is already working, and let's layer on. And I think that has been what's given us an opening to have those conversations with workforce partners, is not only because of my relationships with y'all, but also because philanthropy has begged the question around wraparound services and folks not being wholly successful once they land on the job site, right? Now, I'm not suggesting philanthropy is going to answer all the questions, right? But I do think that philanthropy has a lot of power, which we all know to be true. And it's about how to not organizations, events like this, the work that the Greater Philadelphia Philanthropy Network is holding on trust-based philanthropy can continue to support the work that we're trying to do with integrity. Those are my thoughts off the cuff, but I want to sit with that a little bit more. Dan, do you have thoughts? And then we'll invite Sheila to the conversation.
I'd love to hear what Sheila has to say first. I'll bring up all my minutes for the next little bit.
Yeah, Sheila, go for it.
I'm laughing at Dan. And I apologize for being off camera, but to speak to the very salient point that Josh put on the table, sometimes I think it's a false dichotomy to say that because of some kneeling to power or inability to speak truth to power, that people don't do effective programming. In this space, I find a lot of people, you don't know what you don't know, and they are doing the best that they can. And I would say in this space in particular, that seems to be the bar of acceptance. Am I trying? Do I care? As opposed to, if it was a for-profit space, it would be, are we effective in some way? And I think that's the conversation. And I hate to get bogged down in the, even though they're real, the dynamics of power. But it is my experience of folks, because we're all workforce development folks, that people do want to be better, that they do want to provide better service, that they do want to have the muscle to speak the truth to people who are funding. I sat in LendFest, and part of that conversation was they brought me in because they wanted to know how to say the funders are just sitting there, in their ivory towers trying to figure it out without actually engaging anyone. But it's part of our role to say, this is how we can effectively achieve the societal goals that you are funding. And we can't do it in that way. It's our job to speak truth both to employers and to funders, and to be the best that we can be internally. And that means knowing more than wanting to help. We're having conversations, but we're not talking about the actual structure of workforce development, like how many people are actually trained in professional facilitation or professional instructional design. Instead, think that because they're willing to stand up in front of the class, that means it's okay to do it. It's not. And so where's that standard? Well, nonprofits work like every other market, right? You screw it up long enough, you won't be in business anymore, to Dan's point, right? How is that? That's capitalism at play, in some way. I think our frustration is that there are poor players in the space. Well, what business doesn't have poor players?
Great point.
Raina had, oh, I should be just Raina's comment in the chat.
Yeah. And the question Raina had was, how do we create space so these conversations where it can happen? And it kind of touches to what Sheila was saying, the organizations who are unaware. I don't know what the this is happening. What's the this, Raina? But if I can maybe braid some comments together between what you and Sheila said around they're unaware because they're undertrained themselves. I think there's also the piece, yeah, okay, good. And I think there's also the piece around the ability to say no, right? There are so many nonprofits that are cash-strapped, and there's been studies about, not to mention only Black-led nonprofits, right? Or nonprofits led by communities of color, or executive directors of color who don't have the resources, right? Who are just cash strapped and don't have the ability to opine and say, actually, employer, here's how you could do this better to reach your goal, to edit the idea and say, actually, not this, it's more like that. And I think that can happen too, in terms of stifling the actual innovation that will get you to the outcome you're hoping for, right? That's actually shared, but again, folks in the ivory tower having very few ideas about how to effectuate the change and not believing participant voices when they say, here's what I need. No, you don't really need that. No, not really that. I don't have any money for rent. Can I get any? Nah, you just need to go work. So, I think there's also the undermining of folks' ideas of what they need to solve their individual problems, while we could do a better job of solving the systemic problems that they don't interact with on a system-wide level, but it's more interpersonal. So creating spaces to have these conversations is now, right? This is why Dan was on this call with me, because we wanted to talk about it. It's a little bit too quiet, and so we want to just be a little more public about what we're wrestling with, because I know Dan and I are not alone as we wrestle these questions.
And the other thing too is it is way safer for me to say these things than it is for you.
Yeah.
Is the fact, right? And that's the other part is that we have these, racism, yes, but also there's that virtue test, right? Like you said, somebody needs money for rent. My fundamental assumption is that they'll probably squander it, so I'm going to make them jump through hoops to get it. When if they just had rent, every study says if you just have a place to live, it's going to be okay, right? Like how many problems go away, right? If you just have money for food, you just had that. Every study about basic income or just fundamental assistance, right?
Right.
But if we think about so many of the funding mechanisms, especially ones that are publicly funded, how much money goes toward fraud prevention for fraud that really is not material, right? How much time, energy, and audits and proof of income, right?
Yeah.
It's harder to get assistance often than it is to get a small business loan if you look like me.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Okay. We have 15 minutes left, so I'll open it up for more questions and comments and thoughts. Thank you, Taylor, Sheila, and Josh for weighing in here. What else are we not saying? Because now you can say that. So what else are we not saying? I'll take a beat. I'm not uncomfortable with silence. So yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
Well, I am. It's like any opportunity to get 2 cents in. I think you made a good point earlier that said we're in an interesting industry where there is no mechanism, to really kind of address the core components of effective programming, right, that we can make available across nonprofits. Like you and I have had the conversation, and Dan and I too have had the conversation around the whole driving performance through data and the negative reactions we get from our workforce partners when we talk about data, as if looking at data means we don't care or makes us more callous, to the issues of folks. And a lot of times when we're having these conversations with both, especially government funding, right, in some way, we're not prepared to be able to effectively justify the position that we are taking from a quantitative basis so that we can talk about how this will actually impact programming. They think what we're doing is we're just continuing to beg for more resources to support folks in some way. But there's a quantitative case to be made for it that oftentimes we don't engage in. And so therefore, I can tell you as a funder, if you can kind of produce the numbers for me, I'm not going to believe you because you think that's true. So where is your ability to do that? And with funding moving into social impact bonds and all the things that we're talking about, return on investment, et cetera, as we move into the future of work and the whole big data world, you got to know. And a lot of times what we see in workforce development and our partners is they simply don't know, don't collect the data, don't think it should be part of their strategy, right? Because we want to help and that we're leading from the heart. Well, that world is over. Sorry, right? And there has to be this opportunity to build the capacity, right? To move into what workforce in the future will look like. And that means we're looking for a return on investment at workforce development the way we look at any other business. So where's the mechanism we need in Philadelphia to move the dime on that conversation moving forward?
Sheila, can I plus one on something you said that triggered something too? Is
Yep.
that return on investment idea? I think the other thing that we don't say out loud, but we all know, is that when you're working with humans, the economics of scale does not apply.
Mm-hmm.
And folks don't understand that. So if I have one truck, it is more expensive to drive that one truck than it is to drive a fleet of 100 trucks, right? Because I can buy all the gas at bulk and I can buy all the tires at bulk. That trucks and screwdrivers, economics of scale work. If you produce enough numbers, your costs go down.
Right.
If I'm working with humans, and if I have one caseworker for every 10 humans, that number does not change whether I'm working with one human or 1,000 humans. Josh, you said this, right?
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I think, Dan, the point I was trying to make, and it's backed up by some work that Jack Phillips did in Metrics That Matters. It says you can quantify in a dollar-driven way the soft skills gains that people make in your programs. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about return on investment, right? You can look at the employer organization that you work with and you can say, hey, the turnover of the people that I've placed there is half the turnover of what you've done, right? The amount of people who move forward in their occupations were promoted within your organization and continue to add value is twice what you've done when you've hired from the street.
Right.
That's the kind of data I'm talking about. Right. That scale issue, you're absolutely right. And Josh knows we dealt with that at the Skills Initiative, where they're like, everything was, like, you need to be bigger. More people want to do this. And they used to call me the soup Nazi because I was like, we are not watering the soup. You know what I mean? Right? I stole it from Seinfeld, as you well know. But we're not watering the soup because you're right. It's just not 2 times, 3 times, 4 times in the same thing. Right. It's more expensive to do more people. And I don't think people understand that comes with quality.
No, I think that's really true.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's also the challenge on people not knowing if they are in fact being asked to water down the soup. I think there's also like the piece that folks, and by that I mean like employers asking for changes to the program and the workforce training organization being underqualified or underskilled to know that is actually going to fundamentally change the effectiveness of the program, right? I think there's also a piece like, I lost my train of thought. They'll come back to me. I lost my train of thought. Sheila was saying something and I was like, oh, this is why I should have written it down while you were talking. It'll come back to me. Okay, good. All right, friends. So I think we're gonna start to wrap up here. There's a couple of things I wanted to throw into the chat. Amaya, I'm thinking about the philanthropy link around addressing structural racism. There's a really good article from Bridgespan about how philanthropy can be used to obstruct systemic racism. That is, I think it's a good walking papers for this conversation. So we'll throw that up in the chat. Thank you. And I'll, if you could throw in the paper ceiling link in the chat as well. There's lots of conversation from Opportunity at Work around tearing the paper ceiling. You know, the paper ceiling meaning you enter in an organization, and as soon as you enter, you hit with a paper ceiling way because you don't have that 4-year bachelor's degree to actually move, right? So that is particularly challenging. So there's about 50 organizations across the country who have signed in to tear the paper ceiling, and what that means has an impact in the workforce development sector here in Philadelphia. So I want to throw that in the chat as well. Dan, any closing remarks?
I just like so appreciate you, obviously. That was awesome. And everybody here. And to your point, like just like these are all solvable problems. Like the paper ceiling 110, how many organizations just said we're not going to do college degrees anymore, right? They're only solvable if you believe they're solvable. And then suddenly you can find it. And that's kind of the exciting thing about conversations like this, is that like turns out these are all solvable things. It's not easy, but it's not intractable. But you have to act in that way, you know, and that's the fun and exciting part for me of being in a group like this.
Great. Well, thank you for having ECS here in the conversation. We don't directly do workforce development, but we support it. And so this is an opportunity for me to have a great conversation with a good colleague and some more existing colleagues and new colleagues into this wonderful conversation about what Philly is doing well, what we're doing right, and what we need to change. So thank you, Amaya. Thank you, Philanthropy Week. And I guess that's all, folks.
And recording, yes, and this recording will be sent out too. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it.
No problem.